Good afternoon. First, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. I'm really pleased to share this research with all of you. I need to clear up something about the title. Sammies was a term that was used for World War I soldiers. It essentially meant soldiers of Uncle Sam. It was a term that was given to U.S. soldiers. However, in this case, since we're talking about 3 black soldiers from Alabama, it has a double entendre because minstrels were very popular during this period. So it's also an allusion to Sambos. And many of these soldiers were caricatured in the media. Media would write in dialect when they would record interviews, or I should say print interviews with these soldiers. And so the term Sammy does not mean, it's not a slur, but as I said, in this case, it does have a double meaning. I put this on this slide up on the screen because I wanted to tell you that this story has a very interesting sort of beginning. Oops, didn't mean to make it that small. I started this research when I was a graduate student at the University of Iowa. And it dates back now to 1994. And so a professor had taken us to the local Jefferson County archives. And the archivist had taken out several collections to show us. This was a graduate class. And so among the collections that she showed us was a collection about the military execution at Camp Dodge. And I remember thinking at the time, boy, I would really like to do more research on this case. Now, mind you, in 1994, my family and I were living in Iowa, and I frankly had no idea where I would be hired. I had no idea where I would end up living. And it's sort of ironic that I end up here in Alabama. I'm happy to be here in Alabama, but it's ironic that I would end up here in Alabama because insofar as this story is concerned, when I was a graduate student, I pretty much sort of explored this and thought about this from the Iowa angle. Since I've been in Alabama, I am now intrigued by the Alabama angle. So it's almost as if I've come 180 degrees in this project. And so I asked the father of a friend of mine, who is a veteran, if he would kindly go to the National Archives and see if he could ascertain anything about court-martial records for these 3 soldiers. Well, he did go to the archives, and what he was told is that the records, I don't know if you can see this, but the record for, this is the record for Robert Johnson, was charged out. That's a charge slip for the National Archives. It was charged out in 1943 and never returned. And so, of course, you know, my heart sank. And so I'm thinking, okay, so there's no research here because there's nothing to research. Well, I struck up a conversation with a librarian at the university library. And she said, well, have you considered writing your congressman? I said, no. And she said, write your congressman. So I wrote my congressman, who was Jim Leach at the time. And so Congressman Leach, thankfully, inquired about the missing court-martial transcripts for these 3 soldiers. What I did not know then, but know now, when a member of Congress makes a request of the National Archives, the National Archives assigns a staff person to that request. Their job is to fulfill that request. Because Congressman Leach had interceded, a staff member had been assigned to go through the bowels of the National Archives and locate these transcripts. Well, in about 3 months, they found all 3 transcripts, and they declassified all 3 of these transcripts. I am convinced that no one had seen these transcripts since 1943, when I received them in 1994. This has been a long journey, a very interesting journey, but a very long journey. So let's get to the story. The Iowa State Legislature abolished the death penalty in 1965. By then, only 41 men had been put to death by the state. The state's only triple hanging occurred on July 5th, 1918, when 3 black soldiers from Alabama were hanged on the campgrounds. Those soldiers were 22-year-old Frank Allen, or Georgiana in Butler County, 23-year-old Robert Johnson, Sheffield in Colbert County, and 31-year-old Stanley Tramble of Roanoke in Randolph County. All 3 of these men were part of the 88th Division, which was a part of the 92 Combat Division. We're told that all 3,000 black soldiers in camp, most of whom were from Alabama, were ordered to the parade grounds to assemble around the scaffolding that had been erected by the military police officers. We're told a reporter who witnessed this execution wrote, quote, that the scene resembled an amphitheater. In the center were the gallows. On every side were banked tier after tier of soldiers. And so the soldiers literally ringed the gallows, and the black soldiers, the 3,000 black soldiers that were there, were the closest to the gallows. Now, when I first learned of this story in 1994, my immediate reaction was, oh, this was a lynching. And because when I was intrigued by the fact that the black soldiers had to stand there and watch this, they literally had to stand at attention and observe this execution. It took about 40 minutes for all 3 men to die. They died of asphyxiation. No one of the men's necks were broken, and so they literally strangled to death. The hanging of Fred Allen, Robert Johnson, and Stanley Tramble is Iowa's only multiple execution, Iowa's only triple execution and Iowa's only military execution. The Camp Dodge hangings coincide with a historical and cultural moment and movement where race conflated military and civilian criminal codes and local customs. The eugenic movement codified scientific racist laws and social theories, portraying black men as rapists. Eugenicists introduced racial integrity laws and anti-miscegenation statutes, arguing that interracial marriage was akin to race, meaning white suicide. One commentator, Kevin Gaines, writes in his book, the Southern newspapers popularized fears of miscegenation and Southern black monsters, and silent films such as The Birth of the Nation caricatured images of the oversexed black brute. The 92nd article of war covered murder and rape. It defined rape as having carnal knowledge of a woman by force and without her consent, and could be committed on a female of any age. Now, conviction of Article 92 could either render a sentence of the death penalty or a sentence of life imprisonment. The Alabama nativity of these three soldiers, coupled with the fact that the crime had happened in Placid, Iowa, Allen Johnson and Tramble represented the type of menace and incorrigible Negro brutes that white Northerners feared and Southerners loathed. We're told that Southern patriarchal reasoning concluded that the best method to inculcate absolute respect for the law and black ruffians was decisive punishment. This was summed up in the news or the headlines of a local paper, and the headline read for July 6, 1918, Army Justice Swift and Sure. The Camp Dodge hangings occurred during the first U.S. conscription of African Americans to fight in a U.S. uniform. Up until World War I, black men who fought for the United States volunteered. So every war up until World War I, the black men who fought in those wars fought as volunteers. World War I was the first war where, or I should say the Great War was the first war where black men, like white men, were conscripted into service. This was a high watermark for African American men. In fact, one historian wrote that the Selective Service Act of May 18, 1917 accomplished three things for African Americans. This legislation allowed whites to reconsider blacks' willingness to fight for the United States. It also offered an opportunity for blacks to show their patriotism and loyalty, and it raised blacks' self-worth and self-esteem and encouraged them to demand more from the federal government. One newspaper reported the national draft means more, perhaps, to the American Negro than anything that has happened to him since his release from slavery. Black middle-class leadership pinned their hopes of the race on the performance of black soldiers. So black soldiers had this burden of race, if you will. Camp Dodge. Camp Dodge was the namesake of a Civil War general, Grenville M. Dodge. It was about 6,000 acres. It had more than 2,400 buildings, and it was the training base for the 88th Division in the National Army. Now, there were 16 white divisions and 2 segregated black divisions. The full combat segregated division was the 92nd Division. There was also a 93rd division, but that division was provisional. It never reached combat strength. The 88th was billeted with the 92nd Combat Division. We're told that the provisional 93rd Combat Division was made up of black National Guard troops. The War Department registered an estimated 750,000 Negroes, the term they used then, by June of 1917. Many of these black draftees became the genesis of the famed 366th Infantry, the first combat unit of the 88th sent to France and to see combat in France. With the headline, Negro Draft to train at Camp Dodge. The Montgomery Advertiser reported that the Provost Marshal had announced that assignments of Southern drafted Negroes to camps outside of their own states. Black draftees from Alabama, Florida, and Tennessee went to northern cantonments in Iowa, New Jersey, and Illinois, respectively. The historical significance of black men being drafted into military service coincided with the establishment by the War Department of the first Negro officers training camp. Prior to this war, there were 4 segregated units in the United States military that came out of the Civil War. 2 were cavalry units and 2 were infantry units. The 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and the 25th Infantry were those 4 segregated units. Officially named the Fort Des Moines Training Camp for Negro Officers, the segregated facility opened on June 17, 1917. This officers training school was a 3-month school. Pressured into fruition by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, black colleges, and black civic organizations, the War Department created the Negro Officers School as a social experiment. So this school was really very much like the Tuskegee Army Airfield. That is, whites in the War Department in the United States Army were dubious about whether or not black men had, quote unquote, the right stuff to be officers in the United States military. They felt that they lacked the intelligence. They felt that they lacked the courage to be officers. And so they, as I said, they were very doubtful that black men could be officers in the U.S. military. Black folks, on the other hand, were completely convinced that black men could be officers. Proponents of the Fort Des Moines School vociferously argued that black men were fit of body and mind to become officers in the United States Army. The resolve and tenacity of these black leaders could be summed up in the words of African-American newspaperman John Mitchell Jr., who warned President Woodrow Wilson, quote, "No officers, no fight." The Fort Des Moines Training School represented the creme de la creme of black intelligentsia. College presidents and other black leaders literally went through their campuses and handpicked students and faculty and staff. Again, we see this years later with the Tuskegee Army cadets, the Air Cadets, because failure was not an option. They wanted to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that these men did possess the talent, the intelligence to be officers in the United States Army. Middle-class African Americans believed that the Fort Des Moines School was a means to an end, full personhood. In fact, the NAACP editorialized, "No, we have not gained all our rights, but we have gained the rights and gained them rapidly and effectively by our loyalty and time and trial." 629 men received commissions as first and second lieutenants and captains from the Fort Des Moines School on October 15th, 1917. Special Secretary, or the Special Assistants to the Secretary of War, Emmett Scott, and I'll talk more about him in a minute, was the commencement speaker. Scott told those new officers that I know you will bear in mind that you and those who serve with you have in your keeping the good name of a proud, expectant, and confident people. Thank God, neither you nor your race is on trial to prove its patriotism. Black leaders and some white congressmen oppose racially segregated camps. Conversely, South Carolina Congressman Richard Smith Walley did not mince words, quote, if Southern Negroes are armed with guns, a race war will surely arise. The Birmingham Ledger echoed those sentiments when it wrote, sooner or later, the War Department will realize that Negro troops should not be trained in the South, and the sooner the better. While black registrants during the 3 registration days totaled 160,000, of which 25,873 were inducted into service, 2 important African American leaders coming who worked in the war were civilians, namely Emmett J. Scott and Robert Russa Moten. Neither of these men were military. Secretary of War Newton D. Baker appointed Scott as his special assistant for Negro troops. For his part, Moten served as chairman of the Negro Committee of the Council of Defense, although his influence extended well beyond the state of Alabama. Scott had been the personal secretary of Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee Institute for 18 years, and when Booker T. Washington died in 1915, Scott became the personal secretary of Robert Russa Moten, who succeeded Booker T. Washington as principal of Tuskegee Institute. What I think my research shows is that Scott and Moten were probably the 2 greatest civilians who worked with the United States in the war effort. Both of these men had barnstormed the state and the country, making patriotic speeches, making appeals to various audiences to buy war bonds, to be mindful of rationing. And I think because of the efforts of these 2 men, that blacks really galvanized behind this war. Now, mind you, blacks were a little ambivalent about the United States government. Woodrow Wilson, as W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, was no friend of African Americans. He instituted segregation in federal agencies. He had a private screening of The Birth of a Nation at the White House. He had a very caustic meeting with a group of black leaders at the White House. So, you know, as I said, black folks were a little ambivalent about whether or not they should be enthusiastic about fighting to make the world safe for democracy, when they argued democracy was not safe for them in the United States. And it was because, I would argue, of the efforts of Robert Russa Moten and Emmett Scott, that blacks did support in very large measure the war efforts. And so I think these men deserve a lot of credit. I think, you know, I don't think it was a coincidence that both of these men were from Tuskegee Institute. Tuskegee Institute, in my opinion, at the time or during the life of Booker T. Washington, was probably the most important black institution of education in the Deep South. And, you know, people groused about Booker T. Washington, but, you know, Booker T. Washington had on his board of trustees arguably the two wealthiest men in America. Andrew Carnegie was one of them. Julius Rosenwald was another. Julius Rosenwald, of course, was co-founder of Sears and Roebuck, which was a catalog company then, and Andrew Carnegie was the founder of Carnegie Steel, which subsequently became U.S. Steel. So Booker T. Washington didn't hurt, didn't want for much. In fact, I tell my students when they visit Tuskegee's campus for the first time, and we do this when family come to visit us, because my family and I are from Montgomery, and so Tuskegee's campus is about less than a 30-minute drive from Montgomery. And we always, when it's open, take them to the Oaks. The Oaks is the home of Booker T. Washington. It's right there on main campus. And I take them there for a reason. Booker T. Washington had features in his home that no one, or I shouldn't say no one, very few people had during his lifetime. He had indoor plumbing. I mean, Booker T. Washington lived very well, and largely because of the philanthropy of persons like Carnegie and persons like Rosenwald. And so I think Tuskegee plays a prominent role in this story. And so this is a backdrop for this execution in Iowa. And nevertheless, both Scott and Moten had disdained black men such as Allen, Tramble, and Johnson because they did not, they threatened the peace. And this is something that crime caused in the earlier 20th century for a lot of black leaders. Black and white, or black on white crime vexed African American leaders, or for black middle class leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote in 1903 in his talented 10th essay that the question was not whether or not educated blacks should work to uplift race, but whether black criminals were worthy of being saved. If you read W.E.B. Du Bois's talented 10th essay, a lot of people overlook that portion of the essay. Du Bois literally says in this essay, ask the question rhetorically, this notion about whether or not some people, if some people are not or unworthy of being saved. And I think that was a conundrum that a lot of black leadership in the late 19th century, early 20th century faced when a horrific crime was committed by a black person against a white person. As a matter of fact, in a speech before the annual convention of the Negro Christian Endeavor Society in June 1918, President C.A. Wingate had opined, quote, "We must disown the criminal and shiftless Negro. Since the world is fighting for a new democracy, we must fight for a new Negro, a Negro who will not furnish a majority of state prisoners," end quote. The tacit attention that the black press played to the execution at Camp Dodge is really interesting to me. In fact, the only direct reference that I could find, or have found so far, to this execution was printed in the Chicago Defender and was reported by Ben Baker, who talked about or who reported on a race conference that took place in Washington, D.C. And ironically enough, it was Robert Russell Moten who made reference to the execution, except Robert Russell Moten went on to warn his audience, quote, "This is everybody's war. In these days of frankness and justice, we must be frank and just with ourselves. If public attention is called to our frailties, then we must accept and we will get somewhere." Camp Dodge's hangings had engendered no hue and cry within the Des Moines African American community. And Des Moines had a fairly sizable African American community, had one of the oldest black newspapers, The Bystander, and not a single article in The Bystander, again, insofar as I have been able to locate on this execution. And I have written about other executions of blacks during this time period, namely my dissertation, which was about the last juvenile female executed in the United States. It was a 17-year-old black girl who was executed in Virginia in 1912. And one of the things that intrigued me and still intrigues me about that story is the lack of outrage within certain circles over Virginia Christian was the girl who was executed over her execution. A lot of people had gainsayed and invade the military justice system, and they talked about it being arbitrary. They talked about it being autocratic. They talked about it as, or criticized it for not providing accused with due process rights. And so I'm sure there are some of you sitting here who have wondered this question, did these men commit this crime? And frankly, I don't know whether or not they committed the crime. But this is what I am convinced of. I am convinced that they did not get a vigorous defense. And they deserved a vigorous defense. One of the questions that nettles me about this story is, what would persuade 3 black men born and raised in Alabama to go to Iowa and rape a white girl on military grounds? That doesn't make any sense to me. Now, they could have been stone dead crazy, but that doesn't make any sense to me. And so I'm baffled by that. But, you know, whether or not they were mentally competent never came up in their trial. It was never raised by defense. These men were tried in a matter of hours and convicted in a matter of hours. In the case of Fred Allen, there was not even a unanimous decision. Only 2/3 of the board, the court-martial board, voted for him to receive the death penalty. None of these boards considered life imprisonment for either of or any of these 3 men, even though all 3 of them had no prior convictions. And so these guys, as I said, I don't know whether or not they committed this crime, but I am convinced that they did not have a jury of their peers, that they did not have adequate defense or adequate representation. And it was a foregone conclusion that they were going to be convicted. So, you know, this story, while it's about the execution of 3 black soldiers from Alabama, is also about what happened to black soldiers and white soldiers when they found themselves crosswise with the military justice system. There were hearings held in the wake of the war in Congress, where the Committee on Military Affairs just roundly assailed the Judge Advocate General's office. And perhaps the most egregious case of military injustice occurred with the men who were executed from the 24th Infantry for a riot that took place in Houston, Texas, in August 1917. There were 96, I believe, members of the 24th Infantry who were court-martialed for mutiny and for rioting. 13 of whom were found guilty, 13 of whom were executed the day after they were found guilty, without President Woodrow Wilson reviewing their court-martial transcripts and without President Woodrow Wilson approving their death sentences. Subsequently, 6 more soldiers from that infantry unit would be executed for their participation in the riots. So 19 soldiers, black soldiers from the 24th Infantry were executed. As a result of that execution, Woodrow Wilson made it clear to military commanders that any soldier that received a death sentence, that his court-martial record would have to be sent to Washington, D.C., to the JAG office and reviewed there, and the president would personally review these court-martial records. And so that happened as a result of the execution of the soldiers in the 24th Infantry. Also, these soldiers' court-martial records did not reach the JAG office until 4 months after they had been executed. And so by then it was virtually nothing that the JAG office could do. But it did help other soldiers because there were 19 black soldiers at Camp Grant in Illinois who were accused of rape. And they had been convicted in a court-martial. And the JAG, once JAG had reviewed their court-martial records, they threw out most of the convictions. So there was at least another level or layer of eyes that were on these cases. I want to reserve time for questions, but I do want to read at least a portion of a letter that was sent to Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois by a black soldier serving in France, and I think it sort of underscores what black men felt at the time, and this sort of two-ness, as Du Bois talks about in his Double Consciousness essay. And so what I'm reading is on a handwritten letter, and this is on page 3 of that handwritten letter. And this soldier writes, "If democracy in the United States means disenfranchisement, Jim Crowism, lynching laws, biased judges and juries, segregation taxes without representation, and no representatives in any form or any of the lawmaking bodies of the United States, if that is the white America idea of true democracy, then why did we fight Germany?" Why did black men die here in France, 3,000 miles from their homes? Was it to make democracy safe for white people in America? If we have fought to make safe democracy for the white races, we will soon fight to make it safe for ourselves. Thank you very much. Yes.
I appreciate your comments all the way through and trying to make memory of these dates. Like you started off with World War I episode of execution, and you used it through your speech, the problems the militaries had in advance of Negroes or men of color. That was well accepted. I didn't understand to the very last the connection there, because you didn't say what they were charged with. It was on federal property, whether that was a U.S. Army post or whether it was a National Guard. You mentioned one time National Guard. But if that was a court-martial in 1917, it wasn't on federal property. That was a jurisdiction. The judge advocate was on that post. That would have been hammered. You said it didn't reach 3 months later. You must be talking about the judge advocate of the United States.
Yes, yes.
I went in the military in '56 as a enlisted man, and later 21 years an officer. And Tuskegee, you were absolutely right, was used as an example place for the furtherance of, and it turned out to be wonderful and future generations. But I remember the last execution by court was done by Patton in World War II, and it was a white man. And he was shot to death at the firing squad. Yeah. Now, I don't know what the hanging rule was in Iowa, but if it's federal, I reckon it was at that time in World War I. It must have been hanging. Yeah. But the transition somewhere between before I went in World War II, and before '56, before that time, there was white officers over all black units. Their switch was made and the army was integrated sometime between 46 and 56, because when I went in, it was then unsegregated. But I've seen that stroke. We displayed it really well. But in 1917, we'll never know what was done. But there was a court-martial. You said there was no jury. Yes, there would have to be a jury.
No, I'm saying there were black soldiers on base, but they were not part of the board. They did not sit in judgment of these 3 men. The court-martial board were all white soldiers. And so that's what I mean, they did not have a jury of their peers. They were not represented by black, or they did not have black legal representation, even though on the camp of Fort Des Moines, there were lawyers who were officer cadets at Fort Des Moines.
And was it a general court-martial?
Yes, it was. It was a general court-martial.
You had one enlisted man on that.
Yeah.
The rest were officers.
Right. Well, they were officers. That's why I mentioned Fort Des Moines, because these men were officers. They would have been either first, second lieutenants, or captains. But
I've had problems trying to follow that, but now at the end you kind of summed it up. But missing records and all of that, if you've done the research, we'll never know. But there was really a trial, because that's on military property, that's military jurisdiction. Now, whether the representation, I know on the general court-martial you've got to have one enlisted man. And the reason they're all out in the circle, you must observe that, and that's made to teach you men. That was 1917. I don't know what happened in World War II, but the last one was done by General Patton. And that was at that time at firing squad. Yeah. In the Civil War, a lot were executed. Stonewall Jackson had 2 of his men executed. But I just want to bring those points out. You've done a marvelous job, though. Was this a train? You mentioned this was sort of like Tuskegee, this Iowa.
Yes.
And that was a trial for officers.
Yes.
So at that this is way back in 1917.
Yes, sir. The Fort Des Moines School opened in June 1917. They graduated their one and only class in October 1917.
Okay, now those officers, where did they go?
They went primarily to the 88th Division, to Camp Dodge. So they literally went 10 miles from Fort Des Moines to Camp Dodge.
Did they have blacks under their command?
Yes, sir.
Officers?
Yes.
They did?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But no one above the rank of captain.
All right, this was at the end of World War I.
Well, yeah, because, you know, we entered the war in April 1917 in the United States. And so by the time these officers or these men became officers, this was October. So the war was a little more than a year from being over. 1918. Right. No, right.
Okay, you've clarified some of that.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
The rape charge. Who brought it and how?
The record is a little fuzzy about that. I think one could read the record to suggest that the camp commander brought the rape charge. The 17-year-old girl, Jessica Barnes, did not charge these men or bring charges of rape against these men. These charges were levied by the commander on base.
Did she live on base? I mean, what was her connection to that?
She was visiting a soldier on base. She worked as a telephone operator on base, but no, she did not live on base. She lived in Des Moines, but she did not live on base. There were 25 soldiers that were hanged during World War I on American soil. 24 of those 25 soldiers were black. 19 of those 25 soldiers were from Texas and the 24th Infantry. 3 of those soldiers were the Iowa 3 that were hanged, and 2 of those soldiers were 2 more soldiers that were hanged in Texas for murder. The men in Iowa were court-martialed, or I should say they were executed for their conviction of violating the 92nd Article of War, which covered rape and murder.
How did you get to Iowa?
Actually, I went to Iowa from Maryland. You know, I recruited Iowa. I mean, I wanted to be in a graduate program where they were genuinely interested in me completing my degree, because I knew too many people who were ABDs, and I did not want to be among them. And so Iowa made a commitment that if I came and did everything that I was supposed to do, that I would graduate. And thankfully, my wife is sitting right behind you. She has a few gray hairs, and some of those are from Iowa. So, yeah, we made it.
Did you have the opportunity to track down any family?
No, that's been a real thorny issue. I've tried my very best to find living, relatives of these 3 soldiers. It's like a cold case, and even though one of these soldiers, Fred Allen, his body was actually returned to Alabama by another black soldier. It's really been difficult. But I'm also a librarian, and so I have this stubborn streak in me when it comes to research. I always proceed with the notion that it does exist. I just have to find it. And so I'm tenacious. I'm like a dog with a bone. So I found more on this case than than anybody knew existed. One of the things that still bothers me about this case is that I don't have photos of these soldiers. I really want photos. There was a very bad fire in St. Louis back in the 1970s or 80s, and so a lot of military records were destroyed in that fire, and I just pray that their records, their personnel records weren't a part or went up in flames and when that center for the National Archives caught fire.
How would you try to find their families? I mean, their families are still maybe in those areas. Do you go to churches, talk to pastors? Do you?
I have. I've spoken to local librarians. I've spoken to local archivists. And I haven't given up. I'm still searching.
Small towns.
Yeah, I'm still searching. So, I'm hopeful, but, I know as a result of the work that I did for my PhD, that sometimes people don't want to be found. I found relatives of the young girl who was the subject, or is the subject of my dissertation. And when I contacted them, the first question that one of her distant cousins said to me over the phone is that, how did you learn of this? He said, this is a deep family secret. We don't talk about this in our family. And he wouldn't speak to me, and I respect that. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Absolutely irrelevant. The Navy is not authorized to execute. They made the mistake of captain in 1848, known the son of the Secretary of the Navy, who immediately issued an order that there would be no execution in the United States Navy, so it's not an issue.
Yeah, I don't know if this is still true in the military, but during the Great War, death by hanging was a dishonorable death. Death by firing squad was an honorable death. And I always chuckle because I'm thinking, like, if you're going to kill me, do I really care? So, dead is dead. So these men they were executed dishonorably. So that's hence the title, dishonorable death. So. Yes, sir.
One question, Derryn, I wanted to ask you about. You mentioned the lack of response in the African American press. Did you find anything in the Chicago Defender? Because they always champion causes like that.
One article. And, thank God for genealogy. I mean, honest to goodness. And here's what I mean by that. Because there are so many people who are now tracing their family roots, companies have gone back and archived all of these old newspapers. And so I have a treasure trove now available to me to research, whereas 10 years ago, these papers were just gone. Relatedly, Monroe work at Tuskegee Institute started something called the Clipping Files, where he and his staff would clip black newspapers for articles of note or significance about black people. God bless Monroe work, honest to goodness, because those clippings files have now been microfilmed. And so there are articles or available to researchers for newspapers that have just gone out of existence. You can't find them anywhere, they're gone. And it's, as someone who likes to dig around a lot in this time period, I'm really grateful for these companies, but they really didn't do it for me. But I appreciate it nonetheless. Other questions? Well, I want to thank you, all of you. I hope you come back when This work of mine is finally published. I'm going to submit it to the University of Alabama Press, and I'm real eager to see it in print. Thank you very much.
What will the title be?
I don't know. I'm horrible with titles. I'm going to leave that to the publisher. Thank you very much.
Thank you.